I think, like most old people, when they're speaking to someone very young, thinking of themselves when they were the same age, I would simply say that it's very important in whatever role you're in, whatever job you have, whatever course you're taking, to try to do the best that you can. And if you try to do the best that you can, things are more likely to work out well than if you don't try.
Welcome to the UMGC podcast, Unstoppable Stories, with your host, Lauren Cardillo.
Today, we're joined by Joe Arden, who has had an amazing career. Among the things he's done are, let's think, worked in a think tank, Army intelligence officer, D1 basketball player, and 40 years with UMGC as both a professor and the director of different divisions here. Welcome, Joe, and thanks so much for joining us on our podcast.
And thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward.
So out of all the jobs that you've had or the stops you've made in your career, some of which I just listed, what's been your favorite and why?
Well, clearly, the favorite has been working with, quote, the University of Maryland, which when I joined in 1967, there was only the University of Maryland. There were not the various campuses. And so folks of my generation, even though we're very well aware of UMUC and UMGC, we often refer just to Maryland or University of Maryland. But clearly the Maryland position, the various roles that I held from 1967 to 2007 remain the highlight of my life in the sense of being extremely rewarding in that I felt, more than felt, I knew that I was engaged in something that was of social and educational value at a very high level to all of the students involved. And so clearly the Maryland, UMUC, UMGC experience is the highlight of my life, professionally speaking, for sure.
You've told me several times the story of how you got hired, but tell it again, because it's sort of one of those things where you sit down and talk to someone and all of a sudden they change your life with offering you an opportunity you didn't know existed.
I was in Bangkok, Thailand, which is where I'm speaking to you from as well. I was in Bangkok, Thailand in the late 66, 67 period after having been in the Army in Vietnam for somewhat more than a year, 1965 into 1966. I was a Army first lieutenant and then captain in Army intelligence. And when I was discharged from the Army, I accepted a position with a think tank in Thailand that was doing a research project for a combination of the DOD and the government of Thailand. So one day, out of quite the blue, I received a telephone call from the Education Services Officer, which meant a civilian position, usually a GS 11 or 12, in the Army Bangkok Education Center. And this Education Services Officer told me that there was going to be a University of Maryland administrator from Tokyo visiting Bangkok fairly soon. And he asked me, did I think I would be interested in teaching adjunct with the University of Maryland while I was there in Thailand working with the think tank? I said yes. And so he set up an interview, and I had an interview with then Area Director for Southeast Asia, Dr. Joe Mabbitt, who later became the director of the then Far East Division. And during that interview, a breakfast interview, when he was describing the program to me, explaining the program, I, under the impression that we were speaking of an adjunct position, during the conversation, I found out, he indicated that there were a group of faculty who, instead of being stationary in one location, Bangkok, Tokyo, Seoul, Okinawa, wherever, there were a group of faculty who traveled around, had different assignments during the different 8-week terms, 5 8-week terms an academic year. And when that was said to me, I sort of stopped the conversation and said, tell me more about that. He did. And I said, I think I would be quite interested in applying for one of those positions. And he said, fine, gave me the appropriate paperwork. I filled out the paperwork, gave it back to him while he was there in not the same breakfast meeting, but while he was in Bangkok. And very shortly thereafter, I was contacted from Tokyo and offered a position for academic year 1967-68.
Had you ever heard of a position like this or a college doing this sort of thing while you were there?
No, I had not, and it remained something of a mystery how the Education Services officer really knew I existed. I asked him that, and he said that he was simply informed by, he didn't quite remember that he was there. Someone, a fairly young American, was there with a PhD in the social sciences, and so he got my name and phone number.
Now that was fortuitous. I mean,
It was fortuitous.
so what was your first salary? Do you remember what it was for that 1 year of traveling around?
Yes, I do. It was for $7,500 for the 4 terms, and then the fifth term was extra pay. I think maybe 1,015, maybe 1,500, and this was a very, very significant salary cut from me for me because the DoD funded think tank paid a very handsome salary, around $22,000 a year. But I was very uncomfortable. I'll speak very directly here. I was very uncomfortable in the role, as I had very much disagreed with U.S. policy in Vietnam during the war while I was in the military. I had very much disagreed with, and yet I found myself, after leaving the military, after no longer being an Army officer, I found myself directly working on a DoD-funded project in Thailand that had implications for the Vietnam War. Although it was not dealing directly with the Vietnam War, I was uncomfortable without in any way putting myself on a pedestal.
Mhm.
I was uncomfortable, and therefore I didn't hesitate at all about taking a significant salary cut. It was the best professional decision I ever made in my life.
Did you end up in situations that first year while you were teaching where you're teaching military people, obviously, you're not agreeing with the war? Did that interfere at all with your teaching? Was it something that made you uncomfortable while you were doing that, or no one cared because
No, not at all. It did not make uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. My first term was in Korea in September, October 1967. I was both at an Army installation and an Air Force installation, teaching at 2 different installations. My second term was in Vietnam. I volunteered. At that time, assignments to Vietnam were voluntary for the Maryland faculty. Later, 3 or 4 years later, they became required if one cast one's fate. But in the late 60s, they were still voluntary, and I volunteered for Vietnam because I certainly felt comfortable to be there,
Mhm.
and I certainly was very pleased to be teaching American military who were in the service there. So that was a non-issue for me. And then my third term that year was in Thailand, not in Bangkok, but in a military base south of Bangkok. And then my term 4 that year was in Taiwan, Taipei, Taiwan. And term 5 was in northern Japan at an Air Force installation, Misawa.
I know that I have read and you have sent me things of former students talking about how much you influenced them or affected them while you were teaching. Um, when those people reach out to you in the past, how did that make you feel? And tell us the story of, one in particular, if you can.
Well, every faculty member, whether in teacher, whether in kindergarten or in postgraduate, would like to think that he or she had some impact, some value, some lasting value perhaps to their students. But the reality is that most teachers never have a chance to really know with any certainty whether that is the case or not. Now, with regard to the Maryland program, on a constant basis, and I think I can speak for many faculty in this regard, because the students were older than the typical 18, 19, 20-year-old, they were not reluctant to often let you know that that you had made an impact, that you felt that you'd done something of value for them, that you'd given them something of value. I did have this one particularly dramatic instance of realizing with pleasure that I had had a very positive impact. In 1996, I was, maybe it was 95 or 96, maybe even 94. I was then the director of the European program. And one day in my office in Heidelberg, in the morning mail, an envelope with Joe Arden, University of Maryland, the correct APO number, personal written on it, was delivered to me along with the other mail. And so when I opened it, there was a handwritten short note from a student, a person who began by saying, "You will not remember me, Dr. Arden." And he was correct. I did not remember him. He gave me his name, and he told me that he had been in my class in Bien Hoa, Vietnam in 1968-69, the next academic year. The name meant nothing to me. He went on to say that it was a very difficult time for him being in the Air Force in Vietnam, in Bien Hoa, and that my class, and he referred to some of the books that I had assigned to the class. He referred to The Quite American by Graham Greene, a couple of other books that I'd assigned. And he said they made a tremendous difference in his entire being while they're in Vietnam. So what I did was to take advantage of my director role and contacted the Asian program and said, "Could you send me the transcript for this man?" And they did.
I like that they still had the transcript from almost
They did.
30
They had the
years.
transcript, a hard copy they sent me. And instead of being an A student in the class, he had received a C. He had earned a C.
But you still made an impact, even though he got a C.
He went on to explain that he'd had a very successful business professional career in California, and he very much had, as we found out more about him in the next year or so. And finally, he was featured a year or two later in one of the UMGC alumni magazines because he had had a very successful career. Yeah, that was a unusually poignant moment in the sense of opening the envelope, reading this hand-printed message of someone who had been in my class literally 28, 29, 30 years earlier. So, yeah, that was a good feeling. Thank you for asking.
That's amazing. You were the only really university out there teaching military. How did UMGC, UMUC, UMD end up in that position where what you were doing was very unique?
As you will know, the European program began with the University of Maryland in 1949-50. And because of the success of the program in Europe, when a few years later in the mid-1950s, University of California, Berkeley, which had begun a program in Asia and the Pacific through the U.S. government, through the U.S. military in 52 or 53, UC Berkeley wanted to pull out, and they did pull out. And because of the success of the Maryland program in Europe since 1949, the Pentagon, through the Pacific Command, contacted Ray Ahrensberger, who was then the senior administrator with Maryland, the quote famous flying dean, and asked him, would Maryland like to extend its program to Asia and replace UC Berkeley and have a both European program and an Asian program? And Ahrensberger certainly had no problem in saying yes. And so in 1956-57, the then Far East Division of the University of Maryland began offering classes.
Why was it that Maryland succeeded? And what was the drive? Why did a university think it was important to teach military students?
I think the only answer is there that Ray Ahrensberger and his close associate sidekick, Stan Drasek, were simply unusually perspicacious. Going back to 1949, when they were together there in College Park, the Pentagon did approach several major American universities there on the East Coast in the greater Maryland, D.C., Virginia area. They approached several universities about starting the program, a program in Europe. And the only one of the universities in this very different world, when the concept of adults going to school was odd and strange, when going to school on military bases was strange, and when going to school overseas on military bases was bizarre. Ahrensberger and Drazek were the only university through Maryland to say yes. And so that led to the Maryland program beginning in Europe in 1949 and moving on to Asia in 1956.
What do you think their motivation was if you ever had that conversation with them? Because as you just said, it was very odd.
I think there the answer has to be in the personality and character and interest of Ray Ahrensberger. A bigger than life personality, once featured in Reader's Digest Unforgettable Characters, a person filled with four-letter words, a person filled with jokes that were not supposed to be told in polite company, a person whose personality allowed him to be on a first-name basis with every senior general from Tokyo to Heidelberg to the Pentagon, and I think simply the concept appealed to him greatly. Ahrensberger's own background was that he had been in Russia, been in the Soviet Union during the mid-1930s, not for a full academic year, but he had gone there to study psychology, allegedly with Pavlov. Whether that's really the case or not, I'm not quite sure. But he was in the Soviet Union. And he was the sort of person who would have been willing to go there in the mid-1930s. And it certainly wasn't because he was a left-winger and interested in socialism. Quite the contrary. Quite the contrary. So I think simply the concept of having these programs around the world in all these different places appealed to him in a very visceral manner. And he was an ideal person for the role. Had he come along 25, 30 years later, he would have been a disaster. All of the things that made him be so successful would have been taboo in a bit of a later period.
What appealed to you? Because you had gone to a traditional university 4 years. What was it about the job that appealed to you that said, I can help military people get a college education?
Beyond any question, it was a combination of what you've just said, heightened by a very strong fascination since my adolescent days in West Texas, being fascinated with faraway places with strange sounding names. And that appealed to me tremendously. I had done a fair bit of travel even before being in the military in Vietnam. I had spent a year in graduate school at Victoria University in New Zealand. I had done that for 1 year. And following that year, to illustrate when I say I had a fair bit of international travel experience for someone that young, I had taken a ship from Wellington, New Zealand to Sydney, and I got off the ship in Sydney. It was a Dutch ship, took the train across to Perth, where I picked the ship back up. And then the ship continued on to Singapore, which was my first Asian city, and I still remember clearly everything about that initial 24 hours in Singapore. And I got off the ship in Colombo, and then a day or two later took a plane to then Madras in southern India, now Chennai in southern India. And that was in mid-October 1962. I had gone to New Zealand in January 1962. The way to summarize what happened from there is to say that on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1962, 2.5 months later, after traveling overland by train and bus, I arrived in London. And so I had traveled up throughout India, all the way up to Kashmir and Ladakh, into Pakistan, into Iran, into Iraq, through the Middle East, Israel, Jerusalem before the Six-Day War in 1967, into Jordan, Syria, Turkey, and finally into Western Europe. And so that was the trip that sealed my fate with regard to international travel and being interested in being overseas in a world of faraway places and strange sounding names. And I had almost no money. I was traveling very cheap. And so I had massive culture shock in lots of different places, but it was an extremely and incalculably valuable experience.
Once again, you're listening to Joe Arden on Unstoppable Stories. If you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to like or subscribe on your favorite podcast channel. So, Joe, let's jump back to what you just said. You're at this point like 20 something, you've traveled all over the world, and the opportunity comes up to go to UMGC Europe at some point after you start work. Did you want to go to Europe after you loved Asia?
Yes, I had 3 years, 67, 68, 68, 69, 69, 7 as a faculty member in Asia. And so the opportunity or the possibility of spending another year, and at that time, most overseas faculty were limited to 4 years. I say that with some hesitation because it was not always closely administered, but I did want to spend time in Europe, and so I applied for a transfer to Europe, and the transfer was approved. And so I went to Europe, and for 70, 71, I was a faculty member in Europe. I was term 1 in Turkey. I was term 2 and 3 in Naples, Italy, and term 4 and 5, I was at different locations in Germany. And to illustrate my life in those 4 years as a faculty member, 3 in Asia, 1 in Europe, 5 terms a year, so that was 20 terms, 20 terms. I made 19 moves. The only time I ever had consecutive assignments in the same geographic location was in 69, 70, term 2 and 3 of that year. I was in Naples, Italy. That was the only time that I was in the same location for 2 consecutive terms, and I loved that. That was marvelous. I was very happy with that.
And I'm sure you learned how to travel light and how to adapt and all those things that are great skills. What encouraged you finally to jump from teaching and moving around to becoming, administration and staying with UMGC? Because I'm guessing you could have gone other places.
Well, I think there I owe a tremendous loud and prolonged and direct thanks to Benjamin Massey, who was certainly, during my years as an administrator with Maryland, the first 30 of my years as administrator, was both my boss and my mentor, and over the years, good friend. I had met Ben in 1969 in Europe, in Asia, when he transferred from Europe to Tokyo to be the director of the Asian program, the Far East Division. He had been 2 years in Asia, 69, 70, 70, 71. He transferred back to Europe as director. And the idea of being an administrator had not occurred to me, which is very strange given how I loved the job for these next 30 some odd years. But it had not occurred to me. And so I visited him in late July 1971 just to congratulate him on coming to Europe. As I was about to leave the building, not during the meeting with him, there was a message at the door as one walked out of the office in Heidelberg. Dr. Massey would like to see you. So I went back to see him. That was in late July 1971. And he then brought up and he explained that there were 2 administrators leaving. One was the area director for what was called Benelux, Mideast, North Africa, and the other was the coordinator for the Government and History Department, sort of the chair. And he said, I have the idea of combining these 2 roles into one position and would like to offer you the job. I was quite dumbfounded. I'd really never imagined that. And so I said, well, let me have the weekend. It was a Friday. Let me have the weekend to think about this. And I did think about it over the weekend, contacted him on the Monday, spoke to 2 or 3 of my friends. And on Monday, I told him I would like very much to do that. I said, I have, however, with another faculty member whom he knew, I said, I really have had a long-standing commitment to do a road trip, a car trip through northern Germany, Denmark, and into Norway. I really would I would hope I could do that trip. It'd be about a 10-day trip. And he said, yes, you can do the trip. And so I did the trip and came back and took over that dual job in early August 1971, and just was very lucky to have had that offer made to me and feel highly fortunate that Ben Massey was there to be a mentor and to be a boss and to be the fine person and good friend that he was.
So what was it about the, I guess, 34 years, 35 years in administration that you loved? What was it about the job?
I loved it for reasons that would really not be so possible in today's world. I loved it because of the fact that one had a great deal of authority, to put it very directly. One had a lot of authority, and one could make decisions that were very real decisions about affecting their lives, their world, the students' world, the education center's world. One had the authority to make decisions that had an impact. You knew the effect of your decision quite quickly, quite quickly. And the reality was also that because the overseas programs were a long way from College Park, so the overseas programs of that era had far greater autonomy, to be very direct, than the overseas programs do today. And I don't in any way, make that observation in a negative sense toward today's UMGC. Quite the contrary. There are great advantages in the system that now exists. It played to the things I could do well and minimized the many things that I don't do well.
I hear you and I understand you.
Yeah.
When you would tell people, and I'm sure still today, that there were faculty who moved around from different military bases and teach students, or today stay on military bases and teach students, what were people's reaction? I mean, I didn't know about it until I started working here.
Yeah, certainly people always were interested. Almost always they'd never heard of the concept. One reaction often was, well, but weren't you teaching on military bases? What about academic freedom? This was never an issue in any way at all. For example, when I was teaching, I taught, quote, subjects like American government, American foreign policy, Asian politics, those sort of subjects. And never was there any sense at all that I would be restricted in any untoward manner with regard to expressing a view or for students expressing a view. And some of the memoirs that in the Overseas Maryland Association memoir bring that out, of faculty emphasizing that aspect of the program. So this was a very rewarding theme that often surprised people who didn't know very much about the military or didn't understand the military. The fact that I'd been in the Army was an advantage. There's no question about that in the sense of teaching military students. That meant that I was able more easily to relate to their world. That played to my advantage as a faculty member, and it played certainly to my advantage as an administrator working with the military over these decades in Asia and Europe.
This year is the 70th anniversary of Asia.
Yes.
What kind of milestone is that? I mean, does that surprise you? That's a really long time, not as much as UMGC Europe, but I think people sometimes forget about Asia, and 70 years is pretty phenomenal.
70 years is a long while. I was invited by UMGC to be in Germany for the 70th anniversary of the European program. And I cannot say that I'm surprised that Maryland would have been there in Europe for now well more than 70 years, and now in Asia for 70 years, because the foundations of the programs were so strong.
You have now stayed in Asia and have not come back to the States. I mean, you come here for visits, but
Yes.
for you, what's the appeal of Asia? Why are you still there?
I suppose a part of it is simply that I haven't lived in America, Lauren, in the sense of living in America since early 1965, before the Army sent me to Vietnam. And so being overseas, living overseas, is not something when I was no longer with Maryland, which was 2007, and has now been 19 years. It was not something, returning to the States to live, since already I had been 40 years, was not something that really entered my mind. Rather, the question was, where would I want to settle overseas? that was that was the real question. Where would I want to be overseas? And it was fairly easy to decide on Bangkok. It was fairly easy to settle on Bangkok because I had had very always good experiences in Thailand. My first trip to Thailand, which I remember very clearly, I was in the army. I was a captain in Vietnam at that time, and I had an assignment that meant that I needed to go to Thailand in the Army intelligence job, go to Thailand and go up to Laos. I would be in Thailand for a week or 10 days. I had a very safe and comfortable job in the Army. No great James Bond stories, unfortunately. My life was not in constant danger. I had a weapon assigned to me. I never fired it except in practice. I'm quite sure no one ever shot at me, Joe Arden, as an individual. 4 or 5 times I was in the area where there was general shooting, but not at me as an individual. I had an apartment in Saigon. I had a motorcycle. It was my introduction to French food and French wine. I had a very nice Vietnamese girlfriend. My life was not uncomfortable by any means. However, there was a never ending sense of danger in Vietnam. There was a curfew from many places, including hotels that I was in Saigon. There, you saw shooting at night every night. There was a never ending sense of potential danger. And the Vietnamese, understandably, 1965, they had already had 25 years of war, beginning in 1940 with what they called the Japanese War, then continuing after World War II with what they called the French War, and then finally what they called the American War. So they had become somewhat hardened as a people. They had to in order to survive. Whereas coming into Thailand, there was no war, there was no curfew. People today who come to Thailand after these hundreds of millions of tourists in the last 60 years speak of how soft the Thai people are. 60 years ago, all the more so. So, plus I actually still knew people from Thailand from all those years ago that I had maintained contact with. So it was a very easy decision for me to decide to settle in Thailand.
There was some song that was played that would tell people they needed to evacuate and that there was some UMGC sign, well, actually, UMD sign. Tell us a little about that sort of period and how UMD was actually very involved in it.
Yes, that was in the spring of 1975, late April. And indeed, there's a Time magazine story that mentions this, which we being the Maryland teams that were writing the proposals to try to win the next contract, we used to illustrate to the military that we, Maryland, will always be there for you wherever you are. That, as has been noted in a couple of movies as well, not the movies didn't mention Maryland, but there was a song that was played on AFN, Armed Forces Network, or maybe it was FEN, then Far East Network, that was to signal all Americans together at different assembly points in order to evacuate Saigon. And we had a number of classes going on in Saigon at that time. I was not director in April 75 of the Asian program. I was still in Europe. I transferred in August 75 back to Asia. I was the director who dealt with the incompletes in the class. There were a number of incompletes in the different classes, and I dealt with those incompletes. And a very poignant story, if you'll allow me, about 3 years later, 2 years, 77, 78, a postcard arrived in Yokota. Maybe we went to the embassy to pick up the postcard. I don't remember that. But the postcard was with a Malaysian stamp, and the postcard was just written to University of Maryland, American Embassy, Tokyo. So either somehow they delivered it out to Yokota, or maybe we went down to pick it up. The writer of the postcard gave his name, which was a Vietnamese name, and explained that he had been a faculty member teaching mathematics in that last term, the term of the spring of 75, and that he was one of the boat people, and he had gotten his family out of Vietnam with the boat people to Malaysia, and was asking, could Maryland do anything to help him and his family in Malaysia on one of the camps? So, of course, I looked up his file, and he had done a master's, I've forgotten, either at UCLA or USC in math, and had taught 3 or 4 courses with us. So naturally enough, with zero problem, as you can imagine, we distributed that information to the staff and to faculty, and we raised money, and we got on the phone with the camp and through the embassy in Kuala Lumpur and in Tokyo, and we were able to assist him and his family getting to Southern California.
I doubt that there's a college story like that today, you know.
One doubt.
I mean, because it would have to go up the food chain, and you'd have to figure out how to do it, and and you just made it happen. So I have 2 last questions for you. One is, when you talked about being in teaching in Vietnam, there were things starting to sort of rumble, but you never had like soldiers who went off to do something who didn't come back in classes. Yes?
Not in my classes, no.
Okay.
Individually in my class, no. Certainly at several of the locations I taught in Vietnam, students in the class did come into the class, typically always in their fatigues, but quite a few occasions came in the class carrying their rifle because they'd been out on doing something, quote, in the field that day. But no, never did I have a student not come back. No.
Because I would imagine that would be devastating for anybody,
Yes, of course,
especially
of course.
faculty. So my last question is, if you could look at that, kid in West Texas, and that kid saw you, what your life had become, what would you say to that kid in West Texas? How did things work out?
I think, like most old people, when they're speaking to someone very young, thinking of themselves when they were the same age, I would simply say that it's very important in whatever role you're in, whatever job you have, whatever course you're taking, to try to do the best that you can.
Mhm.
And if you try to do the best that you can, things are more likely to work out well than if you don't try.
And so for you, what started as an appointment to have breakfast turned into a career, a lifelong passion.
And I still walk past the hotel where I met for breakfast at least once a week. The hotel has been renovated many times, of course, but rather amazingly, the breakfast area, which is also quite new, is in the same format that it was.
Are they serving the same food? That's really
That I don't know.
Well, Joe, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I really appreciate it. I think this is a great podcast for people to watch, to learn how really UMGC has been an unstoppable story, and then your work with UMGC as well. So thank you.
I assure you, Lauren, entirely my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. So for everyone listening and watching, please remember to like and subscribe if you want to see more unstoppable stories. You can even catch up on older episodes from previous years by going to your preferred podcast channel. We will see you next time. And thanks again, Joe.
Thank you.